A Probi X says, the badge reader outside Lab 7 made a sound I'd never heard before. Not the usual clean beep when you swipe in, something lower. A tone that felt almost apologetic. I looked down at my ID card. The one with my name, my photo, my 22 years of service printed right under the company logo I helped design, and watched the little light on the reader cycle from green to yellow to red. I didn't move. I just stood there in the hallway with my coffee still warm in my hand, listening to the ventilation system hum, and thought, she actually did it. My daughter-in-law had actually done it. The email had come at 6:47 that morning. 2 paragraphs. No phone call first, no meeting scheduled, no HR present the way the employee handbook, the one I'd helped write in 2004, said there should be. Just 2 paragraphs with my name in the subject line and the phrase, effective immediately, in the second sentence. My son's wife, the woman who'd sat at my Thanksgiving table 9 times. The woman my son had introduced to me as the smartest person I've ever met, the night he brought her home from business school. She was now the chief operating officer of BioNorth Therapeutics, and I was standing in a hallway that no longer recognized me. Let me back up, because the setup matters. It always matters. I joined BioNorth in 2003 as a senior process chemist. The company was 11 people working out of a converted warehouse in Raleigh, North Carolina. The founder, a man named Gerald Marsh, had a vision for pharmaceutical manufacturing that most of the industry thought was 20 years too early. He wanted to build drug production systems that could scale in real time, not the slow, rigid batch processing that dominated the field, but something adaptive, something that could respond to demand, reduce waste, and cut the contamination risk that was sending recalls through the industry every other quarter. I was the one who figured out how to make that vision real. It took me 4 years and 2 complete failures. I ran through 3 different stabilization approaches before I found the process sequence that worked. I documented everything. Every dead end, every temperature variable, every moment where the chemistry behaved differently than the literature said it would. In 2007, I filed the first patent. In 2009, I filed the second. In 2011, after a breakthrough with the continuous flow filtration stage that I still consider the best technical work of my life, I filed the third. 3 patents, assigned to BioNorth, but with a licensing structure that Gerald and I had negotiated carefully, because Gerald was the kind of man who understood that the person who builds the engine deserves different terms than the person who sells the car. The agreement was straightforward. BioNorth held the operational license to use all 3 patents in commercial production for as long as I remained a full-time employee in a technical leadership role. If that employment ended, for any reason initiated by either party, the license reverted to me within 72 hours, and BioNorth would have 90 days to negotiate new terms or cease production. Gerald called it the continuity clause. I called it continuity clause. I called it common sense. The lawyers called it Section 14C of the original IP agreement, and they red flagged it every time a new legal team came through, and every time someone signed off on it anyway because the alternative was asking me to walk away from terms I'd earned. Gerald retired in 2019. His son, my son's college roommate, took over as CEO. He was a decent man with a finance background who knew enough to leave the science division alone. Things were fine. Then my son married Renata. Renata Voss had an MBA from Wharton, a background in management consulting, and an absolute certainty that the pharmaceutical manufacturing sector was being held back by people who were too attached to legacy processes. She said this at dinner once. She was looking at me when she said it. I remember my son laughing and topping off her wine, and I remember thinking, she's going to be a problem someday. I didn't know she was going to be my problem. She joined BioNorth 18 months after the wedding, brought in as a VP of operations. Within a year, she'd reorganized 2 divisions and eliminated a layer of middle management that honestly did need eliminating. She was smart. I won't take that away from her. She walked into a company with real inefficiencies and she found most of them. What she couldn't find or wouldn't look for was the reason certain things were done the way they were done. She came to my office in March, 8 months before the morning with the badge, and told me she wanted to discuss process modernization. She had slides. She had benchmarking data from 3 competitor facilities. She had a proposal to license a third-party automated synthesis platform that a firm in Zurich had been selling to mid-size pharma companies for the past 2 years. I listened to the whole presentation. Then I asked her one question. Does the Zurich platform support continuous flow filtration at the yield tolerances our FDA approval is based on? She said the technical team would adapt it. I asked which technical team. She said she was in the process of bringing in new talent. I asked what would happen to the current process documentation, the documentation that underpinned our 3 approved drug lines and the 2 NDAs we had pending. She said legacy documentation would be archived and the new team would rebuild from current regulatory standards. I told her as clearly and calmly as I could that what she was describing would require us to file new manufacturing supplements with the FDA for every approved product, that the process would take between 18 months and 3 years per product, and that during that period we would either be producing under an approval we were no longer technically compliant with, which was a federal issue, or we would suspend production, which would breach our supply contracts with 4 hospital systems and 2 government formularies. She thanked me for my input. 2 weeks later, she sent me a memo reclassifying my role from Vice President of Process Sciences to Senior Technical Advisor. Same salary, no direct reports, no seat at the leadership table. I didn't fight it. I kept coming in. I kept doing the work. I figured she'd hit the regulatory wall on her own and someone would course correct. What I didn't figure was how fast she'd move once she found a reason to accelerate. The reason arrived in October in the form of a private equity firm that wanted to acquire BioNorth at a valuation that would make everyone on the cap table, including my son, very wealthy. The deal required a clean operational structure, a credible modernization story, and no legacy employment agreements that complicated the IP chain. Section 14C complicated the IP chain. I found out later that the firm's legal team had flagged it in due diligence. I found out later that Renata had told them it would be resolved before closing. I found out later that resolved meant me. The morning of November 14th, I got the 2-paragraph email. I stood in the hallway with my dead badge and my warm coffee and I thought about Section 14C. I thought about the 72-hour clock that had just started. I thought about the acquisition closing date, which I knew because my son had mentioned at a dinner 3 weeks earlier, proud and excited, telling me the family was going to be set for generations. The closing date was November 17th. 72 hours from 6,047 a.m. on November 14th was 6,047 a.m. on November 17th. I finished my coffee in the parking lot. Then I drove home and called my attorney. Her name is Patricia Lund, and she has handled my IP matters since 2006. I called her at 8:15 in the morning, and she picked up on the second ring because that's the kind of attorney Patricia is. I read her the termination email. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marcus, do you understand what just happened to them?" I said I was beginning to. She said she'd have a formal revocation notice drafted and served by end of business. She asked if I wanted to negotiate or if I wanted to let the clock run. I told her to let the clock run. I want to be honest about what happened inside me during those 72 hours, because it wasn't clean. I wasn't some calm strategic operator executing a flawless plan. I was a 53-year-old man who had just been fired by his daughter-in-law via a 2-paragraph email. And part of me was just angry and hurt in the ordinary human way that has nothing to do with patents or leverage or any of that. My son called me at noon on the 14th. He said he'd just heard. He was sorry about how it happened. He was sure it was just a business decision. He hoped I understood. I told him I understood completely. He asked if we could have dinner that week. I said I'd check my calendar and get back to him. What I actually did was go to my home office and pull out the original IP agreement, the 2009 amendment, and all 3 patent filings. And I read through every page of Section 14C one more time. Then I called Patricia back and asked her to confirm something I already knew but needed to hear out loud. She confirmed it. The revocation was automatic. It didn't require my action. The moment my full-time technical employment ended, the license began its return to me. What I could do, and what Patricia had already begun preparing, was file a formal notice with BioNorth's legal team making clear that we were aware of the reversion, that we were documenting the timeline, and that any production activity after the 72-hour window would constitute unlicensed use of patented processes. She filed that notice at 4:30 p.m. on November 14th. I'm told the BioNorth legal team called her back within 20 minutes. I'm told there was some volume involved on their end of the call. The next 36 hours were quiet on my end and apparently catastrophic on theirs. The PE firm's legal team, when they were informed of the notice, immediately suspended their closing review and requested an emergency call with BioNorth's board. The board, which had approved Renata's operational restructuring without apparently reading the IP agreement in full, had a meeting that lasted until midnight on the 15th. My son called me twice during that period. I let both calls go to voicemail. He didn't leave messages. On the morning of November 16th, the day before closing, Renata called me herself. I'll give her this. She didn't pretend. She didn't open with small talk or family pleasantries. She said, "Marcus, I think we need to talk about finding a path forward." I said, "I think you mean you need me to surrender a reversion that is already legally underway and that your own termination decision triggered." She said the termination had been a difficult decision made under significant pressure and that perhaps it had been handled poorly. I said it had been handled exactly as described in 2 paragraphs at 6:47 in the morning. She asked what it would take. I told her I'd have Patricia reach out with terms by end of day. Here is what I asked for. And I want to be clear about why I asked for what I asked for. Because this is where I think the story is actually about something. I did not ask to be reinstated. I didn't want to work there anymore. Not because I was being petty, but because the organization had become something I didn't recognize. And the person who ran it had demonstrated that my 22 years of work could be ended with 2 paragraphs on a Tuesday morning. I did not ask for a share of the acquisition. The money was real and it was large, and I will not pretend the thought didn't cross my mind. But taking a cut of a deal that was built on work I'd done over 2 decades, work that had been undervalued and then stripped from me, felt like accepting that what happened was acceptable if the price was right. It wasn't. What I asked for was this. First, formal reversion of all 3 patents to my name, with clear documentation that BioNorth's operational license going forward would be negotiated on new terms reflecting fair market value for use of patented processes. Patricia had comped similar licenses in the industry and came up with a figure that was uncomfortable for them and accurate for the market. Second, a written acknowledgement, signed by the board, that the termination had been conducted in violation of the terms of my employment agreement and that my contributions to the company's core technology were foundational and were to be formally recorded in the company's historical documentation. Third, and this one surprised them, I think, I asked that the 2 junior process chemists who had been laid off in Renata's first round of restructuring be offered their positions back with back pay for the period they'd been separated. Both of them had worked under me. Both of them knew the processes and ways that the new team Renata was assembling would take years to replicate. They deserved better than they'd gotten. Patricia sent the terms over at 6 p.m. on November 16th. The board meeting ran until 2 a.m. At 14:18 in the morning on November 17th, 2 hours and 29 minutes before the license reversion became legally complete, BioNorth's board chair signed the agreement. The acquisition closed later that day, delayed by 4 hours while the revised IP documentation was processed. The PE firm's managing partner apparently told someone on the BioNorth board that it was the most expensive HR decision he'd ever seen. I heard that secondhand, and I won't pretend it didn't make me smile. My son called me that evening. This time I picked up. The conversation was hard in the way that conversations between people who love each other and have hurt each other are always hard. He said he hadn't known the full details of Section 14C. I believe him. He said he should have pushed back when he first heard about the termination. I believe that too. He said he was sorry, and it sounded like he meant it, and I told him I knew, because I did know, and because being right doesn't mean much if you lose your family in the process of proving it. We had dinner the following Sunday. Renata wasn't there. I don't know what the state of their marriage is, and I have made a deliberate decision to stay out of it. That's not my story to tell or fix. What I can tell you is what came after. Because there's a part of this that matters more to me than the contract terms or the board signatures or any of it. The 2 junior chemists, Daniel and Kwame, were back in the lab within 3 weeks. Kwame called me the day he got the offer. He was quiet for a moment after I explained what had happened, and then he said, "You didn't have to do that." I told him the work required to rebuild those processes would have taken years, and I wasn't about to let that knowledge walk out the door permanently over a restructuring decision made by someone who didn't understand what she was restructuring. He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that has some tears in it. Daniel sent me a handwritten note. I still have it. In February of the following year, the FDA approved our 3rd pending NDA, the one for the extended release formulation that my continuous flow process made possible. My name is listed in the technical documentation as the process inventor. It will be there long after I'm gone. And long after the acquisition and the board meeting and the two-paragraph email have faded into whatever category of memory holds the things that happened and then became just the background of everything that came after. I didn't go back into that building. I consulted independently for a year and then took a position as an adjunct professor at NC State, teaching pharmaceutical process engineering to graduate students who are, almost without exception, smarter and more motivated than anyone I reported to in my last 4 years at BioNorth. I tell them about documentation. I tell them about IP agreements. I tell them to read every clause, especially the ones that seem routine, especially the ones that nobody thinks will ever matter. I tell them that the person who builds the thing is not the same as the person who manages the thing, and that confusing those two roles is a mistake that tends to be expensive. The badge reader outside Lab 7 at BioNorth still exists. I assume it still makes that clean beep when someone swipes in. I assume the hallways still smell like reagent and recycled air and bad coffee from the machine near the elevator. I don't need to go back to know that the processes running in that building, the ones that make the drugs that go into the hospital formularies and the government supply chains and the pharmacy shelves, still run on the chemistry that I figured out in a converted warehouse in Raleigh in the early 2000s through 4 years and 2 complete failures and 1 breakthrough that I still consider the best work of my life. Some things don't stop being true just because someone sends you a 2-paragraph email. That's what I want you to remember. Not the Section 14C, not the 72 hours. Not even the board meeting at 2 in the morning or the managing partner's line about the most expensive HR decision he'd ever seen. Though I'll admit that one stays with me. What I want you to remember is that the work is real and the people who do it are real, and if you spent 22 years building something that works, you have not spent those years accumulating nothing. You spend them accumulating something that doesn't go away when the badge reader turns red. It goes with you.